Welcome to the Going Ballistic Podcast. I'm Ryan Kleckner, and we're here with Jason Kleckner.
Hello, guys. Good to be back again.
You're listening to episode number 7. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave feedback for us on iTunes. Both of those are going to help this podcast succeed and help others find us. And while we're at it, if you're trying to help us succeed, tell somebody else about it. The word of mouth is really going to be a great source, too. We really appreciate it. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook, both under Ryan Kleckner. Today we're talking about AR-15 lower receivers. We're starting Jason's project and building his own AR-15. And this episode is going to be compliance heavy because, as we'll talk later, the lower receiver for the AR-15 is the regulated item, and some of the other current events have to do with firearms compliance. So hopefully it's not too boring for you, but this is kind of right down my day job alley. I'm excited about it. This podcast is going to be produced at least every week, and notes about each show are going to be found at goingballisticpodcast.com/the show's number. So, for example, because this is show number 7, you'll find links and extra info about this episode at goingballisticpodcast.com/7, as in the number 7. And of course, if you're looking to learn more about long-range shooting, please check out my book. I'd appreciate it, The Long-Range Shooting Handbook. It's available on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle formats, and it's also available on iTunes as well. For those of you that do not know, I donate 25% of the proceeds of the book sales to 2 military charities, the Sua Sponte Foundation and the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. All right, let's get to the show. Jason, good to see you again, man.
Good to see you, man. So I'm excited about this AR-15 build, and there is so much stuff out there, so it's good that we're breaking it down piece by piece.
Agreed. So much so that as we were talking about this, folks, before the show, even just to cover the lower receiver is going to be difficult all in one podcast. So if you have additional questions about what we talk about some of the points we bring up, please ask, and we can dive deeper into that section. But do not expect us to be able to cover every variant available, let alone every manufacturer or color or style. We'll just be skimming the surface. So, Jason, we talked about trigger control last week, and you said you went trigger shopping. What did you do?
So I was kind of jumping the gun. I know we're going to build the AR piece by piece, but I decided to run and to the local gun store I like, Shooter's World, and they have some triggers on display that you can play with and cock back and dry fire. My biggest issue that I had was the majority of triggers aren't available to touch or play with, so you know how it feels, how it adjusts. A couple of the ones I touched were way too light. I didn't like them at all. There was one that I played with that I thought was too heavy.
Gotcha. So to keep everyone on track with that big jump I just made, I'm trying to cover some of the old news from some of the things we covered before in the previous podcast, specifically trigger control. And so you're saying, Jason, that how are you supposed to figure out which trigger to buy, I imagine, is your question. And how in the world can you make the decision between all the different pricing points, poundage levels, things like that of the triggers, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're basically reading a description online for most of them, or their website. And then it gets as detailed as, first stage and 2-stage. And what is that?
Right. So single stage and double stage. I don't think we've covered that. So that's a good point. A single stage trigger, there's only one thing happening when you pull the trigger. And I paused there because it almost sounds like I'm going to talk about a single action revolver versus a double action revolver. It's kind of analogous. Only one thing's happening. On a single stage trigger, though, there's only one bearing surface that you're overcoming when you're pulling the trigger. Now, bearing surface means some part of the trigger interfacing or engaging with some part of the sear or the hammer. Sometimes the sear is an extra part. Sometimes the sear is part of a hammer. Sometimes the sear is part of a pin. So what you have is the trigger, which is kind of the part your finger touches. Technically, the shoe is what your finger touches. But that mechanism that's pivoting on a gun, we'll go ahead and just grossly call the entire thing the trigger, somehow, mechanically, is stopping either a hammer from going forward or a firing pin from flying forward. And it either engages that hammer or firing pin directly, as in there's only 2 pieces, or on some firearms there's 3 pieces. There's the trigger, there's a piece in the middle, and then there's the actual firing pins. Like on a Remington 700, there's 3 pieces. That third middle piece is called a sear as an individual piece. But again, sometimes the sear can be a part that you can identify on the trigger itself. So it's not always its own thing. Regardless, the sear is the part that, I don't know how to say it, does the work, is the functional part of what's moving that allows the hammer or the firing pin to go forward. So in a single stage trigger, there's one engagement surface, meaning 2 pieces of metal that are sliding up against each other and then moving out of the way and allowing the hammer to go forward. Well, how polished those are, what angle they're at, what spring tension they're under, all those things, how long the surfaces are, how much travel needs to occur before they get out of each other's way. All those variables come into the pre-travel, over-travel, poundage, grittiness. Every variable you can imagine on a trigger comes into that one bearing surface, effectively. Well, that's a single-stage trigger. There's just one thing to overcome. Your trigger is a 5-pound trigger. That's single stage. Just one thing to worry about. Now, a 2-stage trigger or a double-stage trigger has 2 surfaces or 2 different poundage weights to overcome. So, for example, your first stage could be 4 pounds, and your second stage could be 1 additional pound on top of the 4. So it doesn't step down. You don't pull 4 pounds and then all of a sudden get down to a 1-pound trigger, because I think that would be impossible not to fire the gun, right? After you got over a 4-pound hump to not pull the 1 pound. But what it does is it jumps, in my example I'm giving now, from a 4-pound first stage to a 5-pound second stage. And what's nice about that is you get the security and safety of an overall 5-pound trigger, meaning it still takes 5 pounds of force to make the gun to fire. So you don't have to worry about dropping your hunting rifle or just barely touching the trigger with your finger and having the gun go off. It still takes 5 pounds of pressure. However, 4 of those 5 pounds get to be taken up in that first stage. So while you're still settling in on the rifle, while you're still getting focusing on the reticle, while you're getting ready to shoot, you can take up 4 of the pounds already, and you can feel a slight little wall, a physical boundary where it gets heavier. And at that physical boundary, you're already pulling the 4 pounds, and all it takes for that second stage is 1 additional pound to make the gun fire. So even though you're pulling 5 pounds total, you get to have the benefit of, at the very last second, when you get to decide to make the gun go off, it's only a 1 pound change that makes the gun go off. I absolutely prefer 2-stage triggers. If I could, every rifle I have would have a 2-stage trigger on it. That's because I like having a heavy enough trigger that it's safe, but also light enough that it can be crisp and I can shoot the firearm without disturbing the sights or the position of the rifle. And there's something about psychologically that 2-stage trigger where I can pull that first stage and get to that wall, and it's easier in my mind to get ready to fire that second stage than if I have my finger just touching air and trying to make contact with the trigger, then the gun goes off. Getting partial the way there somehow is psychologically better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and is there a noticeable wall? I mean, you pull it and you physically, it's like it stops.
Well, it depends on the trigger, right? So if you have a big difference between your first and second stage, absolutely. Because you're pulling a very light amount of weight, and then the 1 pound pull weight turns into an 8 pound pull weight. So it would be a very distinct wall. Matter of fact, I bet it's open for debate. I don't know about this one, but most AR-15 triggers are usually a 2-stage trigger. It's not 2 bearing surfaces, but what you're doing when you're taking up all that slack is it's still under spring tension. You put your finger on the trigger and you pull quite a bit on that trigger until you feel a wall. Well, just because it's spring tension doesn't mean it's not really a first stage, because that spring tension is there the entire time you're pulling the trigger, right? So it's adding to the overall weight of it. So if I just put in a really strong spring, that would still give me the safety. That would still mean I have to overcome that heavy spring, but you still feel the wall where the trigger goes to engage. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I like, for Remington 700 triggers, I don't think you get a better trigger than Extreme Triggers. That's the name of the company, or the name of the trigger. They are the nicest 2-stage triggers you can feel. I love those things. And their first stage is a spring. So when you look at the mechanism, you adjust the spring tension on that first stage, and you have to overcome that spring tension before you can even get the other parts of the trigger to come into play. So it's actually not a metallic first stage. It's just a spring first stage. But it's really nice that way.
And that's called Extreme.
Extreme triggers. If you Google extreme triggers, you'll see them. They're pricey, but they're worth it. You, in my humble opinion, you don't get a better trigger. Now, I like 2-stage. You may not. 2-stage isn't necessarily better. There are just as many people, maybe more, that think I'm crazy and only want a single-stage trigger. That's not right or wrong. That's fine. You know, a 1911 has a nice crisp single-stage, break to it, and that to most people is an ideal trigger, and they'd want to go after that. A factory bolt-action rifle, almost always, 99% of them have a single-stage trigger. You put your finger on the trigger, you add weight until it breaks. A good trigger break I've heard described as a candy cane breaking. I actually think Jeff Cooper might have said that. I'm not sure. But it's the candy cane theory is that if you can imagine putting your finger on a candy cane and you add pressure, then all of a sudden it just snaps clean. It's not spongy. It doesn't give it all like maybe a carrot would. That candy cane break is what kind of happens on most bolt-action rifles. That's great. I just don't like it as much because I don't like overcoming that 3 or 5 pound hurdle all at once.
No, makes sense.
So you buy an aftermarket trigger to upgrade a Remington trigger, and you get like a Timney or a Jewel or something like that. Both of those are going to come in single or double stage versions. Now on an AR, I really like Geisley triggers. My favorite triggers for AR-15s are Geisley, made by Bill Geisley. Just met him a few times. An incredible guy. Just how neat of a guy he is alone makes you want to support his company. But he makes top-notch quality triggers, and I love his SSA or his SSAE triggers. Those are my 2 favorite triggers he makes. They're both 2-stage triggers. Neither one of them are incredibly light. They're just crisp and nice. But some 3-gun shooters, some guys that want to shoot very fast, loathe a 2-stage trigger, because to them, that's just more they have to get out of the way, and more they have to overcome, 2 different stages and all that movement when they're just trying to shoot the gun as fast as possible. They just want, one single-stage trigger, kind of like the 1911, that goes quickly. So, personal preference.
And in this application, we're attempting to build a long-range AR, so 2-stage sounds like it would be the way to go.
I agree with you. I think, so if this were my AR I were building, I would put a Geisley SSAE trigger in it. We're getting ahead of ourselves, so we'll go into AR-15 triggers next. We're just trying to revisit the old news of trigger pull and how are you supposed to get a trigger and be able to practice that trigger pull. Well, honestly, there's a whole lot of variables in there that matter, so that's a future, I think, entire podcast we could probably dedicate to that.
And it'll be coming. That'll be one of the parts in the build.
Yep. Well, I already gave it away. You guys can go buy it now if you want. Or go check out, go look at the details about this show, and I'll put a link up there so you can show the podcast a little love if you click through to Amazon, so I'd appreciate it. All right, so other either old news or current events, you brought up 41F. That's coming to effect tomorrow or today, depending on people download and listen to this podcast.
The 13th.
Yep. So what are your thoughts on that?
It really doesn't bother me because I'm through a trust, so it's some more added crap, but it really doesn't change a whole lot for me. I think the only addition, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is me and my trustees will need to do a fingerprint card now and a 2x2 photo, and I have to notify the local sheriff, but he can't say yay or nay either way.
That's right. In a nutshell, I wrote an article that The Truth About Guns put up. I appreciate them helping spread the word. That was essentially, are NFA trusts worth it anymore? And I've never been a huge fan of them. I get you had to do them in some circumstances, and there used to be, the way I laid it out in that article is there was 3 main benefits to having an NFA trust. The first benefit would be there's no CLEO, no Chief Law Enforcement Officer approval. And that's not because I encourage you, circumventing law enforcement somehow, but there are some CLEOs in some jurisdictions that just decided they're not going to ever approve NFA paperwork. And that's a whole nother discussion on whether one person should be able to affect the law when we have a democracy of people wanting them legal. Not getting into that. Sometimes you have like a bad CLEO and you need to get around them. So you'd use a trust because you don't need to wait on their approval like you would as an individual. Another reason they are nice is there's no fingerprint or photographs required, or used to be, each and every time. And you could share among the members of the trust with some restrictions, depending on if you lived in different states and things like that. But effectively, you could avoid the Clio approval, avoid the fingerprints and photos, and you could share among your friends. Well, after 41F goes into effect, I think the ATF has taken all or most of the benefit out of a trust. They've even put some of the burden on the individual now. Not bad, but some of it on there. So the no Clio approval reason to get a trust is now gone, because now nobody needs to get Clio approval. And that was an old rule that essentially was, I mean, this was 1934 when, these laws started to go into effect. At the time, the Clio was in the best position to know who was a bad apple. The federal government wasn't going to know that you were the local troublemaker. The local sheriff was most likely to know that you're the local troublemaker. So that's why they needed to have the Clio approval. Well, as time's gone on, the federal government is in a way better position to know if you're a troublemaker than your local law enforcement officer. So the situation flipped. So I think it's good they changed that. But now it's just a notification. You have to notify the Clio, hey, heads up, I'm getting a silencer. Nothing you can do about it, but I'm getting one. Well, they also made that notification requirement go to individuals.
Now, as an individual, you still have to get an approval, I thought. That changed?
No approval. It's notifications for everybody now.
Oh, really?
Yep. So that's why I'm saying trust may not be worth it anymore, because now one of the reasons to get a trust was to avoid a bad Clio. Well, now, after 41F, that doesn't matter anymore. So the bad Clio is now negated.
So the only advantage you have right now is you can still add and remove people from the trust, whereas an individual you can't. That's really the only advantage.
The sharing advantage, right. So in the article, I listed out the benefits in order, 1, 2, 3. Number 1, avoid the bad Clio. Number 2, you didn't have to get fingerprints or photographs. Well, now every responsible person in the trust has to get fingerprints and photographs every single time. And a responsible person is anyone who has legal authority under the trust to, possess and use the items. So if you were getting a trust to avoid the Clio approval, well, that doesn't matter anymore, and that's not going to help you. If you were getting a trust because you wanted to avoid everybody getting fingerprints and photographs, that doesn't matter anymore, because now everyone has to get them. So if you were using the third reason, which was to be able to share among your friends, okay, that one still stands. So the only reason to get a trust now is if you want to be able to share among other folks. And I won't get into whether people can add or subtract, but there's a lot of talk out there about people having certain strategies about who's added on when and who's taken off when, to try and avoid some of the requirements. But the point remains, it actually got easier for everybody. This wasn't a bad gun control thing like everyone was afraid of. I think it actually just made NFA trust not necessarily worth it unless you want to share among people in your household or, friends and family.
Well, no, and that's good, because that was my whole purpose when I got a trust was the individual process a real pain.
Yep, and now the same pain for fingerprints and photos is shared with the trust, and the avoidance of the Clio doesn't mean anything anymore.
Right.
So yeah, that's what's going on now. Now, you people need to be careful. The form, I think it's 5320.20 off the top of my head. I have to look it up. Is the kind of a supplemental notification form that the ATF uses. You have to be careful, because for Form 4, there's certain requirements when you're buying an NFA firearm about you have to send one in with the federal paperwork and one to the Clio for the notification. And then for a Form 1, when you're making it yourself, there's not the same requirements, so it gets a little sticky. Of course, in my day job, I am a firearms attorney, so reach out to me if you want actual legal advice, because what I'm talking about now is not legal advice. We do not have an attorney-client relationship, so beware. Look up the rules on your own. Don't just take all my word for it or what's happening. But the point is, we got to be careful on which forms you do and how it's going to happen. So that's 41F, and welcome to the new world, everybody.
And that's current news for you.
Yeah. All right, so we covered old news. We covered some current event news. So now let's get into the project. So tell me, how much, Jason, have you been daydreaming about your AR-15 project?
Man, it's hard to slow down. I'm telling you. It's me and my buddy Jeff. we spend most of our lunch break probably browsing the internet and looking, and the more we look, the more questions we have. So there's going to be a lot.
All right, so I say we break it down piece by piece. I think you agree. That's the only way to tackle it here.
There's just too much.
Right. And the way to start with an AR-15, or actually any firearm, I'd think, would be at its heart, the frame or receiver. So the frame or receiver of a firearm is the one part of the firearm that is considered a firearm by itself. So I warned you at the beginning this is going to be compliance heavy. We already went into 41F, and now we're going into what makes a gun a gun. So a gun is anything that expels a projectile by an explosive. I think we covered that in a previous podcast myself. So if you have a potato gun that works on compressed air, not a firearm. If you have a potato gun that works on hairspray, it's a firearm because there's an explosion before the projectile comes out. Not saying it's illegal. You're allowed to make your own firearms, but just that's the distinction. Explosion with a projectile. Well, there's 4 definitions to a firearm. We're not going to get into all 4. That was just one of them. Another definition of a firearm is the frame or receiver of anything I just described. So, for an AR-15, the lower receiver is considered the quote-unquote firearm. Now, be careful thinking that all lower receivers are the firearms. This is just for AR-15s. There are other guns, the ACR, for example, where the upper is the firearm. So, don't just think that it's the lower is the gun. You need to, if you're making up your own gun, if you're not sure, a good safe bet is to look at where the serial number is, but that's not always going to tell you because some firearms manufacturers put the serial number in multiple locations. If you really need to know, reach out to me, reach out to your friends at the gun store, or if you're making something yourself, you might have to contact the ATF. There's a whole division on the ATF that can help make that distinction for you. So the lower receiver on an AR-15 is the actual gun by itself. So when you take an AR apart into, I don't know how many pieces, 40 component pieces, you don't have 40 guns, you still have one, and it's right there at that receiver. Now, that receiver also is a firearm before it's finished. So it starts off as a big chunk of, let's say, aluminum in this example, and it goes through a certain manufacturing process and ends a complete lower receiver. Let's say there's 10 steps there. Well, at step 10, it's clearly a firearm, but also at step 9, step 8, maybe even step 7, it's a firearm before it's finished. So the ATF has said that an object, once it is readily convertible to a finished product, is also treated like it's the finished product. So go figure on that one. So that's where this misnomer of a term 80% receiver comes out. 80% receiver is not a legal term. It's not in the law, it's not in ATF regs, it's not recognized by anything formal and official. It is a marketing term. It's not necessarily bad, but you got to be careful with it because there's no meaning of it in the law. I don't want you guys to think that as long as it's only 80% complete, it's not a gun. The contrary, you could actually do the wrong 10% first and have a firearm. So it's when it can be readily converted, and every different firearm and every different court case and every other standard just completely changes from one gun to the next. But AR-15s, thankfully, the ATF has come out and helped us on this one. On an AR-15 lower receiver, you have 2 main cavities, I guess you could say. You have the magazine well up front, and then you have the trigger pocket, or what I call the trigger pocket. That's the whole little cavity where the trigger hammer springs go, the safety goes. And then you're looking down from the top of just an AR-15 receiver by itself. And that's where the hammer pinhole and the trigger pinhole and the safety are drilled through the sides. All that makes it a gun. So if you take an AR-15 lower and finish everything, but you don't touch the trigger pocket, you don't take any material out, it's still completely solid, not only from the top, from the sides, it is not a firearm. However, if you take a chunk of aluminum and you do the trigger pocket first, you just made yourself a gun. It doesn't matter that it can't take a magazine. It doesn't matter that it can't take a safety. It doesn't even matter that if you used it once, it would blow up. The test is if it goes bang once, it's a gun. So be careful out there. That's what a firearm is in a nutshell. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And just another question to add to it. So let's say you're going to order one online. You're going to have it shipped to your local gun store. fill out your paperwork, just like you would be buying a gun.
Okay, so if it's a firearm, right? So if it's crossed that line of being readily convertible, so if it's beyond the point at which somebody at home with some common household tools could either already finish it, or someone already finished it for you, and it's treated as a firearm as it currently sits. It is right now. It's a firearm. Then yes, it must be treated just like any other firearm. So if you buy it from somebody else within your same state, you don't need an FFL. You could do it as a cash transaction at a gun show. You could do it anywhere you want, just like anyone else can sell each other any other firearm. If you go to cross state lines with it, you need to go through an FFL. I even recommend, if you have the chance, always go through an FFL, because then you know who you're dealing with, and they have to go through a background check and kind of be put on record. But yeah, you have to treat it like any other firearm. So if you order it from a company, they're going to have to send it to your local FFL, and you're going to have to go down and get it transferred to you, and it'll be transferred to you as a firearm type receiver. So if you look at that 4473, that's that form you fill out when you buy a gun, they list the type of firearm you're buying: rifle, pistol, revolver, shotgun, or receiver in this case. So, because it's not a pistol yet, and it's not a rifle yet, and that's how you transfer it. Now, if you have it to where it hasn't crossed the line yet, and it's not a firearm yet, then it's a paperweight. And it can be sold, and anything can be done with it, just like any other paperweight can be done, because it's not a gun yet. You can also make your own from scratch. You can make your own from one of those quote-unquote 80% receiver kits. You can actually legally make your own firearm under federal law. You got to be careful with your state laws. But for FFLs, for federal firearms licensees that are licensed as a manufacturer, that are making firearms as a normal course of trade or business, you're in the business of making guns, you have certain marking requirements, like a serial number, for example. If you're an individual and you make your own gun, you don't have to put a serial number on it. You don't have to put any markings on it at all. So that might bear a whole another podcast on how to do that kind of stuff. But does that cover it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we know that the lower receiver is the part of the gun that is the gun. Now let's talk about how we can make them. Most of them are made out of aluminum. Again, 99% of AR-15 lower receivers are made out of aluminum. And there's two major divisions of aluminum AR lowers. They're either forged lowers or billet lowers. And billet lowers are typically more expensive than forged lowers. And billet lowers typically look a lot cooler than forged lowers. Forged lowers are your classic standard AR-15 lower. It is what every other AR-15 lower looks like. Billet AR-15 lowers can have cool angles on them. They can have flared mag wells. They can a whole lot of features that make them look really cool. So a lot of people think that because they're more expensive, because you get these cool angles, they must be better. Well, I mean, maybe you want a cooler looking lower. Then absolutely get yourself a billet lower. But a forged lower is not something to scoff at. A forged lower is actually stronger than a billet lower. So if you really do want like a mil-spec gun, not just mil-spec and looks, but you want the strength and durability out of it, you kind of want to get a forged one. And a forging is they actually take and hammer forge and press the aluminum together so it's under extreme tension, and they make a rough shape of the AR-15 lower. It is still machined and broached and cut to all the critical dimensions. So it's not like one of them has machining done to it and the other one doesn't. Both of them have a whole lot of machining done to them. Just the forging starts out under high pressure and can be stronger. So some higher end ARs out there have these forged lowers. And I've had people often ask me, why in the world does premium AR would still have such a simple looking lower? And that's why.
Well, no, and that I didn't know that. I thought billet was machined, forged wasn't. And it makes sense, though, that you would have to go back and clean up something after you basically cast it out of a mold.
Absolutely. So you can see a big seam, all the way around the actual forging, and the forging's solid, right? So it's it's not cast. So it's not cast in a mold. It's hammered into that shape.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So if it wasn't, it would be a cast lower, right? So the fact that it was forged mean it was put through a hammer forge. It was actually hammered into that shape. So it's been sandwich pressed into that shape. So you're right. If you cast it, that would be different, and you would not want to cast lower. A cast lower, in my opinion, would be weak. You would have porosity issues, meaning you don't know where the might be air bubbles in the casting or things like that. But no, a forging is essentially a billet that's just been hammered into a certain shape. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to say, well, one's billet, one's not. Well, the forging is just a solid chunk of aluminum. It's just got hammered into the general shape of the outside of the lower, so it saves some time and it makes the aluminum stronger. But you get the general shape of the outside already from that forging. So if you want to have a flare that sticks out, you want to make angles that are wider than normal, you can't do that from a forging. You can't add the material there, so they start with just a raw chunk of aluminum that hasn't been hammer forged.
Oh, that's interesting, because I had no idea when they were done forging it, it was still a solid chunk.
Oh yeah. So I will put up pictures for you guys of what a raw forging looks like. And there's only a few forging houses in our country. Matter of fact, there's a lot more receiver houses now, but there used to only be a few receiver houses too. You only had a few places that made these forgings. You only had a few places that actually finished these forgings and machined them into actual lowers for every company out there. I think there's 3 major ones about 2 or 3 years ago. And every company that you could see out there, save a few that made them themselves, got their lowers from these receiver houses, what they call them. You could walk through and tour the receiver house, and you would see a cardboard box or a bin representing just about every major AR manufacturer out there. They're really all made in the same spot. So that's marking variances. That's definitely more compliance, and you guys would understand how that works. But so when a forging is machined, they not only have to clean up a lot of the outside dimensions, to make sure things are true. They, are going to drill through and thread where the buffer tube assembly is going to go. They're going to flatten that off, machine it flat. They're going to cut flat across the top of the lower receiver. They're going to cut the gaps in between the takedown pivot pin holes. They're going to drill the pivot pin holes. That trigger pocket is going to be milled out, which is essentially, a drill bit coming down and moving in a precise spot to cut that metal away. Those hammer trigger pin holes, safety pin holes are going to be drilled through. They're going to mill off where the grip attaches to and thread the bolt for the grip to go into. They're going to cut out and mill where the bolt catch is going to go and drill the hole for that takedown pin. There's an awful lot going on there. The mag well is going to be broached. Broaching is just a fast method of removing material. So I guess you could mill your bag well if you wanted to, but it'd just take way too long. Broaching is like a big cheese grater or like a big saw blade. Okay, so a broach can be, the ones I've seen are 5 or 6 feet long, and it ends up the same size shape rectangle as the mag well, but it starts off a much smaller rectangle with some teeth on it. And then every couple inches, it's got teeth that get bigger and bigger and bigger all the way up to the right size. And they actually take the forging, they slap it down in a fixture, which is a vise that holds it, and they take this like ramrod under this huge hydraulic press, and it just shoves through and just roughly cuts, like a cheese grater, the opening. And that's why if you look in some cheaper AR lowers or some ones where as much care wasn't put into them as you'd like, you can see some of those chatter marks, some of those, vertical kind of marks through the magazine well. And that's from being broach cut, where the trigger pocket has been milled out. So a lot of the markings too on the firearm, on an AR-15 lower, tend to be on the mag well. Some companies will put them outside the trigger pocket, but most of them put something on the mag well. And those markings, if they're stamped in, if they're not milled, if they're pressed into the aluminum, those markings are done before you broach. Because if you broached it first and then tried to stamp into the side of the gun, you'd crack it. So, make sense?
Yep. And if you get into some of the other materials, like I've seen one titanium one, those of course are going to be the same as a billet. They're going to have to take a block, machine it out. What about a composite?
Now, those are molded, right? Those are injection molded, the composites. And the only thing that, from a compliance manufacturing side, they need to be careful of is the serial number has to be on a metal plate. So they have to figure out a way that the metal plate is going to be embedded into the plastic. But other than that, there doesn't need to be any metal in the rest of the thing. Again, I will not go too much on the compliance. There, for those of you that are listening though, that are screaming about the Detectable Firearms Act, you're right. So there's got to be some metal in it, so it shows up under an X-ray. But those are injection molded plastic, and I am not a fan. I don't want them, but I've seen some incredible things with them. As long as you do the lower out of the plastic, I think it's fine. I wouldn't want an upper made out of plastic, just because I would want any failure that might happen in the guns, any case head separation, anything like that, contained in as much strength as possible. The lower, who cares? I can let the lower blow away. But yeah, plastic lowers are popular for some folks. I don't think they give you that much weight savings though. For I don't know how kind of chintzy they feel, but yep, you can buy them out of plastic.
They seem to lower the price of a gun. At least, complete guns that I've seen that have a composite lower, they seem to be much less expensive.
Hugely. It's just an injection molded plastic part, right?
Right.
I mean, it's not made in China, but it's kind of like a made in China type piece. It's just injection mold it, cut off the extra marks, you're done. You don't have to do a forge. These are actually like foundry, like forges that are making these things, a forging house. And then you're shipping across the country to a machining house that makes the receiver. And then you're all this milling, all this cutting, all these dimensions, all this quality control, this broaching, all that's being done. And then you have to send it off to your finisher, right? So if we have aluminum, you're going to anodize it. You need to anodize aluminum. So anodizing aluminum doesn't just color it, it strengthens and hardens the outside layer of the aluminum. So these folks that want to do these 80% lowers, they end up with raw aluminum, which, okay, is fine, but you need to be careful with that, and you might want to consider sending it off and getting it anodized wherever you cut the raw aluminum out, because that's going to be really weak now and it's going to wear away faster. So all those processes, all that shipping, all that everything, plastic, throw it in a mold, inject it, pull it out, you're done. So you're right, it is a lot cheaper.
All right, so I've made up my mind on mine. I'm going with a forged.
You are? All right, well, billet looks cool. I mean, for my plan, I'll be honest, for one of the Kleckner rifles for the AR-15s is going to be billet, just because it's sexy looking. And I like how an upper and a lower can mate together and have some nice lines to them. I also am not going to be breaking my guns, right? I don't need the strength or the heavy use out of it, but currently every single AR I own is forged.
Well, part of the process before we talked, and I've learned what I've just learned, was strictly to cut down essentially about $100 out of the lower for this build. I want to put my money elsewhere when we get to that topic. So I can get a pretty nice, decent lower for about $80 to $100 is what it looks like.
Oh yeah,
that's forged.
And you're not going to be regretting anything. You're not going to have. I mean, you might get some other features. So I guess we can talk about that next. In a milled lower, you can sometimes get more features than you could have in a forged lower. The features aren't necessarily better; they're just features. You can get like ambidextrous controls. They can mill out certain sections and have certain holes and slots cut so that you can have a bolt catch or bolt release on either side of the lower. You can have some of those doodads milled in there. You can have things like you've seen where there's a solid trigger guard. So instead of needing to put in a separate piece that's a trigger guard, the trigger guard can just already be part of the gun. If that's something you want, great, do it. There's also some extra features that you can do actually on a forged or milled that are, lack of a better term, tensioners. They're just very often a set screw with like a plastic cap on it that is drilled and tapped into the bottom side of the lower underneath the grip. So you take the grip off, and you can, with an Allen wrench, you can turn this screw, and as you turn the screw, it rises up into the receiver's trigger pocket, and it presses up against the upper receiver. So if you have too much slop, you can take that, and then you can tension it just right, so you have the right amount of tension. These are all these little features that you can spend extra money on. I don't think they're necessary. I like to be able to change out the trigger guard to a trigger guard I want or feel like having. I mean, come on, half the fun of an AR-15 is, it's Barbie for guys. You get to get all the accessories, and, you get to change stuff out and play with it. And every one I've seen so far that has the trigger guard built in just looks ugly to me. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm actually on the other side. For what I am building and the purpose of what it's going to be for, I'm okay with it being solid.
Except you might be paying more for that.
I haven't seen a huge jump.
Okay.
If it is, it's like $7.
Okay. Yep. Well, that's 7%. You're dealing with $100 lower, right?
No, that's true. No, very true.
So I see.
Or I can get into, yeah, or the billet ones. I think the billet ones we were looking at started at about $260. So it's quite a jump from a forged one. And like you said, so elegantly as it being Barbies for guys, if I want to change the lower to something crazy later, I buy one and I do it.
Yeah,
it'll just all snap back together.
Exactly right. It's not a big. And this is why we're having you do the AR-15 too, not the AR-10 like you had first said you'd wanted to do. Is
correct.
If you buy a in spec AR-15 lower, they're all going to work. You can swap them out completely interchangeable, not going to have any problems. Where at AR-10, good luck. You're going to have, like I think I mentioned, some lowers are an inch longer than other lowers. I mean, that's the whole selling point, but they can be all over the place. You're not going to have that plug and play compatibility that you do with an AR-15. So,
and that's going to be the fun part about it is as I build it and I get to a point where I'm like, I wish I would have changed that. I can change it.
Yes. Yeah. So now let's talk about some of the markings on the lower. So when you have the lower and the features, so let's say you're going to do a forged lower, you're going to have your standard features. You're going to have the bolt catch and bolt release on the left side, things like that. You can have different markings on the gun. You had brought up something about seeing multi before.
Yes, and I was curious what that meant when they said multi-caliber lower.
That's a complete marketing term. So all firearms, when they leave a licensed manufacturer, have to have 5 markings on them. Okay, the 5 markings are the serial number, the make, the model, the caliber or gauge, and the city and state in which it was manufactured. Okay? Now, out of those 5, only one of them has to be on the frame or receiver, and that's the serial number. The remaining 4 marks can all be on the barrel for a rifle or the slide in the case of a pistol. And the way to remember that is the slide covers the barrel, so you might as well be able to put it on the slide. So you can put all 4 of those on the barrel. You can put all 5 of them on the receiver. You can kind of mix them up however you want. Well, in an AR-15, I don't like it when manufacturers make a lower with a caliber on it, unless they're selling it as a finished product. And the reason is, you have no idea what that receiver is going to be. Jason Kleckner walks into an FFL and buys a lower, and it says 223 on it. You might be building a 300 blackout.
Right.
So, one, it does nothing to help traceability, and that's the whole point for the ATF, is they want the caliber on there so they can help trace it in a crime. So they can go back and see the paperwork and, Jason Kleckner bought a 223 receiver, but a 300 blackout may have been used. So that's not going to help anyway. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is it's going to get somebody hurt. If you take a 300 blackout cartridge and you put it into a 223 rifle, there is a chance the bolt can close. I've heard people swear it wouldn't work. I even have gone to engineers that looked at me like I was crazy, and they tried it enough times, and sure enough, it works. You can slam the bolt home hard enough that the bullet in the 300 blackout cartridge will push back into the case a little bit. Well, 300 blackout uses the same magazines. Matter of fact, it uses the same every part of an AR-15 except the barrel. So you're at a range shooting, you're using your 223, I'm using my 300 blackout. We both drop our magazines on the ground. You accidentally grab my magazine, which will fit perfectly fine in your gun because it's the same magazine. You close your bolt, which will close, and you pull the trigger, your gun will explode. There's no way that 30 caliber bullet is going to make it down that 224 caliber barrel. So it is dangerous, in my opinion, to have a marking on a gun that may not actually be the gun. So take that to the next point. You decide to sell your 300 blackout to somebody else, who then sells it to somebody else because they never shot it. And now the person looks at the side of the gun, and let's say you bought a 300 blackout lower. They now look at the lower and it says 300 blackout. Well, I want to go down to Walmart and buy some 300 blackout ammo. They load it full of 300 blackout, they put it in the gun, and they shoot it and never realize that it actually had a barrel for a 223 on there. Gun blows up. So because of all that, manufacturers have been putting the caliber marking, some of them, only on the barrel, which is where it truly matters. That's what the chamber is on the barrel. Well, people are so used to seeing a caliber marking on a lower, they're going to wonder where the missing marking is. So some manufacturers are saying multi, meaning you can do a whole lot of things with this. It can be 6.5 Grendel, it can be 6.8 SPC, it can be 300 Blackout, it can be 223, it can be 556. By the way, 223 and 556 are two very different things. It can be any one of those, so they put the word multi. Some FFLs get themselves in trouble by writing down multi, in their records, but this isn't the free FFL compliance podcast, so I'll stay out of that one. But that's what multi means. Pay no attention to it. It is not any more special or more unique than any other lower. They're just deferring to making sure you actually look at the markings on the barrel to determine what caliber your gun is.
Well, and that clears it up because we were guessing. I almost assumed that it meant that it would shoot both 5.56 and 223. But it makes perfect sense what you're saying.
And that's part of the argument against why you do multi, too, because it's not accurate. In my opinion, leave it off. Caliber gauge doesn't need to be on the lower. If it doesn't need to be on the lower, don't put it there. You go look at a bolt-action rifle, it doesn't have the caliber of the gauge on the receiver. It has it on the barrel. It has it on the barrel because that's what determines what caliber the firearm is. So just leave it blank. And I agree with you. If it says multi, people are going to think that, and they're also going to hurt themselves because they're going to put a 5.56 in a 223 barrel. That's not safe. You're not supposed to do that. So by leaving it off, I think it would make it easier for everybody. But, oh well, that's what multi means. Now, along that same line of not always trusting the markings, don't trust when your gun says safe, semi, and auto. Right? I know you have a rifle that has that on it, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I have the same one. That doesn't mean it's a machine gun. That doesn't mean it shoots full auto just because somebody engraved the word auto on it.
Right, and my understanding of that is there is a certain hole that needs to be in place for that to happen, and then you have another storm to deal with.
Correct. The difference between a semi-auto and a full auto AR-15 receiver is one tiny hole above the safety. So kind of between the safety hole and the top edge of the receiver. So if you ever see an AR-15 receiver that someone's wanting to sell you at a gun show, and you see the safety hole, which is about the diameter, of a pencil, and then above that, between that hole and the top of the receiver, you see a small, about of a 1/16 of an inch hole drilled, regardless of any other markings, that's a machine gun. And yes, that means the difference between them is about 30 seconds in a DeWalt drill. So people that think they're going to try and be cute with it, you're crossing some serious legal lines there. Don't do it. But that one hole is what makes the difference, not the fact that it says auto or full or my favorite, no pew for safe, pew for semi-auto, and then pew, 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 pew for full auto.
Right.
Or any other cute thing they want to put there.
Now, I would imagine you could still get in trouble even if you didn't have the internal components for the full auto and that hole still be on that receiver.
No, there's no imagination. You're right. That's what I'm saying. That hole exists. It's a machine gun. You have a receiver at your house with that hole. You're in possession of a machine gun. So don't drill it thinking you'll get parts someday, or don't drill it just to show somebody how it works. No, that hole is present. It's a machine gun. Regardless if you have the components or not. So that's what some of the markings mean on the guns. We're not getting into depth requirements or stuff like that because you guys aren't FFLs. And if you are, again, call me. I'll help you with that. So any other markings, any other concerns about what you see on a gun?
The only other one that doesn't really apply to me that we were looking at, Jeff was interested in it, was the, and I'm going to probably say this wrong, but ambidextrous lower.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming it had holes for both left and right safeties.
Good question. So there's no really such thing as an ambidextrous lower when it comes to safeties. So an ambidextrous safety is a function of the safety, not the lower. So you can have markings on both sides if you want. That doesn't make a difference. But just about any forged lower out there, you can install an ambidextrous safety, and vice versa. That makes sense?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
Now, the ambidextrous is going to come into the bolt release and the bolt catch, the magazine release, things like that. So you can have, milled lowers will have it to where on the right side of the gun, you can catch the bolt, release the bolt. Or on the left side of the gun, you can release the magazine, things like that.
Okay. So in your opinion, I'm gonna really throw it on you now. Out of all the different brands out there, is there a brand that you like more so than others?
For lowers?
Yeah.
No. Well, in about a month, mine. All of them will supplement mine. No, I don't. I think you get what you pay for, but as I admitted before, there's only a few receiver houses that make them for everybody. So when people run around and say, I have brand X and it's so much better than brand Y, some of those folks don't realize that brand X and Y are even made in the same day and the same shift by the same person at the same company, the same machine, same everything. It's just marketing. So get yourself a quality one. Don't go cheap. I don't just mean in dollar amount. I mean, you can tell if the company's trying to be a budget cheap company or if it's a known established brand.
Right.
But then again, even if it does wear out or even if it isn't right the way you want, like you said, you can buy another one. It's only going to matter if you decide to make it an SBR or if you decide to do something to it. Now you're going to be stuck with that serial number and that lower. You live in a place where it might be pre-banned. You might have an issue. So buy a quality one. Buy not fancy, but buy a true trusted dimensions lower.
Yeah, and like I said, that $100 mark seems to be about where it's at. You can tell some of the really lower ones are like $50, $40.
I'll tell you my favorite budget one. I will do that. Palmetto State Armory. They make an incredible value budget AR-15 lower. And if you get on their website and you get one of their blems, they have blemish sales every once in a while. It's unbeatable. Heck, you can go on their
and that was going to be
buy semi-completed. I bet there's probably 10 or 15 different variations of lowers that are already completed with parts on Palmetto State Armory you can get.
And that was our next question is we saw the blems. And do you find an issue with blems or it's just a mark? I mean, this thing's going to be out being used and scratched up and dinged up anyway.
If it's a reputable company, they're never going to sell you an unsafe or unfunctional gun. It's really going to be it got dinged up. So if that doesn't bother you, then don't let it bother you. I mean, for me, up until recently, most of my guns are, working guns would have 10 different levels of Krylon paint on them after a couple years anyway. By the time you paint them and it wears off and you camo it again and it scratches up. So yeah, I don't care at all. So that's what I think about that. And Palmetto State Armory, now you owe me advertising because I'm going to send everyone away.
Well, and you brought it into kind of towards where my last question is. So with the coatings that they come with, can you re-anodize over something to change the color? Or are you stuck with a type of coating or paint?
I have no idea.
Or
honestly, I don't know. I think you have to for anodizing, I think at the very least to match it, you'd have to bead blast it off. But I think you actually have to anyway because you anodize the first anodizing more. I mean, it's a chemical process that you're changing the surface. I think you would have to bead blast it down and re-anodize it all. Now, there's other coatings you can do which don't harden the material, like Duracoat or Cerakote. I'm a big fan of Cerakote, but it's still just a paint. It's just a name brand of a really nice paint that comes in these cool colors that can be applied in the right way, and in some variations of the paint can be baked on. It's a pretty durable, nice coating. Not as good as anodizing. No matter how hard or how great all these companies say their coating is, it still scratches off. It still wears away. It's a paint. It's a strong paint, but it's a paint. So you want the most durable. You want it anodized. You want steel coated. Like on your barrels and stuff we talk later. You want FNC. Ferritic nitrocarburization. You want Parkerization. You want things like that. The heavy duty mil spec type coatings, not the flashy coatings.
Right. And that's what I'd like to do is I'd like to change the color of it. So on let's say the Cerakoting, there's not an issue with that sticking to the anodized aluminum because I would imagine like aluminum's tricky with paints and stuff. It's its own animal. There's specific paints that I know just from the boats and stuff that just don't stick to it.
So when you send it to somebody to get it Cerakoted, and I have a couple sources for you when you're ready. Matter of fact, just to brag, I'll put a couple pictures of a Cerakote project that one of my buddies did for me on a rifle. It's just awesome Cerakote job. he does a media blast to the aluminum. So I think it doesn't completely take the anodizing off, but it still beats it up a bit so the Cerakote can stick to something.
Okay.
So your homework is find the lower you want. Get, at least one that is a semi-reputable company that's been in business. You can find some reviews. They make a, quality part. If you're getting a forged one, you know what you're getting. It's going to be a strong, should be true to spec lower. If it's a good company and it's a billet lower, you're also going to get a strong, good one. You just need to make the decision which one you want and which markings you want. Some company logos and some names just either look stupid or you may not want on your lower. So it's okay to be a little vain and just pick something that cosmetically you like the look of. This is going to be the heart of your gun, and then you're going to have to go through a gun shop, unless you're making it yourself or finishing it yourself. You're going to have to go to the gun shop and get this thing transferred to you properly. And when you get home and you set that on your workbench, I think you owe us all a picture so we can see this process as it goes along. That's like the frame of the car. You're going to start with that receiver, and everything is going to be built onto that.
Well, I'm going to spend the next few days looking, and I'm hoping by the end of the weekend to order one. That'll be part one. And then, of course, however long it takes to get it here and fill out the paperwork.
All right, we'll stand by and be interested to see what decision you make, which one you go with. I hope for everyone listening, you guys hopefully learned something about your lower options and what the different variables might mean. Again, I told you at the beginning of the podcast, we're not going to cover every company's or even some of the company's options. We're just going to cover the high points here. Jason's got some homework to do on his own to go out and figure out which one he's going to do. And Jason and I will figure out what the next podcast is going to cover, but we're going to go piece by piece till his entire project is done. I might even give a 41F update next podcast to see how everyone has panicked or if the world is still intact. After
tomorrow's doomsday.
Yeah, after the ATF has started working with that. So I appreciate everyone tuning in. Again, if you like what we're doing, if you don't like what we're doing, let us know. We appreciate the feedback and really appreciate the support if you buy the Long Range Shooting Handbook on Amazon. Jason, you got anything?
No, I've learned a bunch. I mean, I've been looking and searching, and no, it's been really great talking to you with the knowledge you have on it, because there's a lot of things I obviously didn't fully understand. So this really is going to help me decide which one I'm going to get. So no, it's been great.
All right, well, good. Now, be careful. I made about half of it up, but I'm not going to tell you which half. So have fun. All right, everybody. Again, appreciate you tuning in. Until next time, take care.
Take care, guys.